Okay, it's Berlin briefing time, and today we're going to get you fully briefed on Olaf Scholz, Germany's chancellor, who is now fighting for his political survival. And he really does have a fight on his hands. He's rated as the most unpopular German leader since reunification more than 30 years ago. So I'm here with DW's Michaela Küfner and Nina Haase, and both of them have covered Scholz throughout his time as Chancellor, so it is great to have you both here. We'll start by finding out about Scholz's very distinct personality and why his Social Democratic Party is far more influential than many people realise. Then we'll talk about how multiple interconnected crises have defined the Scholz era and contributed to that plummeting popularity. And finally, we'll make some predictions. Does Scholz have any chance of getting back into power? And if not, who are the people to watch in the future of the German centre-left? So let's get started. I want to talk first of all about Scholz the man, Scholz the personality, and his background and his party. So let's get started with a little clip that we've got. So we've got a clip that I think expresses his political hallmark pretty well. And this was from his campaign kickoff speech, which was just a few weeks ago. We've got this in two parts. So we're going to hear the first part, I'll translate, then we'll hear the second part, I'll translate, and then we'll talk about it. Okay, so let's hear that clip.
Die nächsten 4 Jahre werden entscheidende Jahre. Jetzt geht es Klarheit. Jetzt geht es Besonnenheit.
So there he's saying the next 4 years will be decisive years. Now
they always are.
What matters now is clarity. What matters now is prudence. Okay, Besonnenheit, prudence. Let's hear the second part of the quote.
Ich bleibe standfest und besonnen. Darauf können sich alle Bürgerinnen und Bürger in Deutschland verlassen.
So I'm going to stay steadfast and prudent, that word again. All of our citizens in Germany can rely on me for that. So, Nina, let's start with you. What is he saying here? This word prudence came up twice there. So Besonnenheit as a noun, I feel like German class now, or besonnen as an adjective. He's trying to exude, I'm prudent, I'm cautious, this is my hallmark.
And I'm wondering whether we've got any linguists out there who maybe want to contribute to this interpretation that is going on about this very concept that Olaf Scholz, yes, he does stress a lot, right? Besonnenheit, he doesn't use a different word more often than this one to describe his own political decision-making process. So if you've got any ideas out there, then feel free to send us your suggestions, but we're going with prudent for now, because he's saying rather than being somebody who will jump to quick decision making, I'm somebody who looks at an unfolding scenario and then I'll think about it and I'll have my consultations with people I trust and then I'll make a decision.
And I mean, it had something in common with Angela Merkel, didn't it? Because Olaf Scholz served as finance minister under Angela Merkel, though they're not in the same party. He's a centre-left social democrat. She was a conservative from the CDU party. But she also had this image, didn't she, of being a very cautious leader, steady, keep the ship steady, stayed in power. That was a recipe for success. She stayed in power for 16 years on that. So Scholz, when he came into power, is a bit like a Merkel 2.0, right?
Well, really, he benefits from the Merkel brand of stability that she built up. And Olaf Scholz, of course, was her deputy chancellor. He was her finance minister. And what he's promising voters here is essentially, I'm going to keep you out of a war with Russia. With me, there won't be a war with Russia. And because I'm not sending the Taurus system to Ukraine, so that is being missiles. Prudent. That is being level-headed. Yeah. And what he's alleging is that everybody else is hot-headed in this competition for these elections on the 23rd of February. So there's an inbuilt accusation against everybody else.
Yeah.
And in a sense, it is breaking with his own logic throughout this, because he only sent German tanks once the Americans sent those Abrams tanks, which they didn't initially want to do. He always stressed he would only send certain weapons together with the other allies. Well, now all other allies have sent cruise missiles. The Americans have, the Brits have, the French have, and the Germans won't. And this is what he labels as prudence and a promise. We won't contribute to any escalation. Only the Olaf Scholz label guarantees that Germany won't get dragged into a conflict.
And
but let's get back to Ukraine later, yeah? Because we want to talk about some of the issues in here. I want to stay on the personality.
I just wanted to say that is an approach that he's adopted that has essentially triggered a lot of criticism from abroad. They don't see that as being prudent, but Olaf Scholz feels it's the right approach to do because German voters give him points for this approach when it comes to the Ukraine war. So he says he has to walk that.
The flip side is the accusation of lack of leadership.
Yeah. Okay. So he's a leader who's out there saying, I'm a steady, keep the ship steady kind of guy. How did he get to this place? What's his background? Nina, he started off as a bit more of a firebrand in his early years.
Yeah, he was the head of the young SPD group, so their youth group. Essentially, he was very much on the left wing of his party at the time. He had also a very different hairstyle, very wiry.
Well, he had hair.
He had hair, but he had really big curls. So if you want to look that up, it's quite entertaining to see old photos of him. And he made his way. He is a lawyer. By profession. He then became the mayor of Hamburg, and that is where he felt he developed his own leadership style of essentially tackling individual projects to boost his own hometown. Hamburg, of course, being one of the most influential towns in Germany, so he built a lot from that.
A big port city.
Big port city, and he's still very proud. So he does mention this background that, he's got a lot of experience running a big ship. And sometimes I get the feeling, but maybe we'll get to that a bit later as well, that he still sees himself as sort of the mayor of Germany, right? He is very, very proud of that period in his life. He did get a lot of criticism for how he dealt with the big G20 meeting in his hometown at the time, when we saw very ugly pictures of the police cracking down on protesters.
There were riots there.
There were riots there against that big meeting. But he then, interestingly, failed to win support to become the party leader. He lost that to more left-wing candidates, but he's always bounced back. And that is also something where he's still proud that he says, okay, I don't care about polls much. In the end, I will always get to where I want to be. And that then proved him right. Lots of people in 2021 thought he was not the natural chancellor candidate. But, other people made mistakes back then in the federal elections. There were slips from the biggest rivals. And, that's got him into the chancellery.
And Michaela, so the Social Democrats, this party that he is a member of his whole life, I mean, he's been on a journey, as we just heard from Nina, from kind of left to a very sort of moderate figure.
He was against capitalism, actually. He wanted to get rid of capitalism altogether. He's gone a very long way.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about the Social Democrats. Have they been on a similar journey?
Well, their journey has been that they've been in government for a very long time, and that's often not seen because they were always most of the time a coalition partner. Often with the conservative CDU-CSU party. The Social Democrats are the oldest party here in Germany. They were against the Nazis when everybody else was still considering whether you can tango with them politically. And that is their historical pride. And that's also something that they set against the conservatives at every opportunity, and particularly right now.
And they go back to the 19th century, right?
Yeah.
And they started off as this workers' movement, essentially, at a time of industrialization when there were no child labor rules. Children were working, actually. People were not protected. Everybody was slaving down in the factories. And then this workers' movement got founded, and that then transformed into the Social Democratic Party. And what they're really proud about is not only that they managed to make this country more social, more open as well already at the beginning of the 20th century. But then they were the only party that voted against Hitler's enabling act in parliament. And they're very, very proud that they didn't help bring Hitler to power.
And so this party now, this is one of the kind of curiosities of this era in German politics. People think, what dominates German politics? And most people would think probably, well, Angela Merkel, even though she's out of power now, but she's still so famous and was in power for so long. But you hinted at this, Michaela. It really struck me. The Social Democrats have been in coalition in Germany on a federal level, on a national level, for 23 out of the last 27 years. They're almost like the permanent party of government.
Yeah, but it also means that they're the permanent party of compromise. The German system is built on compromise. In contrast to the United States, frankly, Germany has a social market economy. It has huge social spending, more than half of the budget. And that also means that if you contrast it with the United States, for instance, I would argue that even the Conservatives would still fit into the Democrat camp in the United States. So this is the kind of spectrum you have here in Germany. The Social Democrats are all about the struggle of the worker, the whole concept of the industrial worker who's struggling against an overbearing employer trying to exploit them. That is the narrative of the Social Democrats. And that's why this whole Zeitenwende, Germany being under pressure, and the whole question of whether there's a need for prioritization of national spending is something that is tearing the Social Democrats apart internally.
Okay, that word Zeitenwende, we'll get to that in just a moment. But yeah, the Social Democrats, I think that's a good way of saying it, Michaela, they've become the party of compromise, and this has been dragging them down. Yeah, so they were at 26% in the last election. Even that doesn't sound like much. At the moment, they're polling 15, 16, right?
Yeah, and that if those polls reflect the election outcome, then that would be their worst result in their history. So, of course, Olaf Scholz stands a lot to lose. Yeah. And, a 10-point loss is something that he would just not survive.
Yeah. And it's actually worse than the European trend of the decline of the big 10 parties. Germany is very late to that development.
Yeah. Okay, so that brings us on to the second part. Yeah, let's look at these crises that have kind of defined the era of Olaf Scholz and have also been dragging down his personal popularity, plus also the popularity of his party. So we've got another soundbite to get us started in this one. And this is probably the biggest moment of Scholz's chancellorship. This was in February 2022, just a couple of days after the Russians invaded Ukraine. This was a soundbite from an address that he made to the parliament here in Berlin. Let's listen.
Wir erleben eine Zeitenwende. Und das bedeutet, die Welt danach ist nicht mehr dieselbe wie die Welt davor.
That's the word we just heard from Michaela there, Zeitenwende. He said, we are experiencing a Zeitenwende, which means a kind of a turning point in history. And that means that the world afterwards is no longer the same as the world that was before. Michaela, tell us about this speech. A couple of days after Russia invaded Ukraine, what was this speech all about and how did it define his chancellorship?
I just want to contextualize it because he really, until a few days before Russia invaded Ukraine, he really thought he could still turn this around through diplomatic means.
So stop the war.
He might be able to stop the war. He went to Kyiv, he went to Ukraine, he went to Moscow, he met with Vladimir Putin.
At the end of one of those very long tables, right? People will remember that.
It was that very long table. I was on that trip and he really did believe he could still move the needle on this whole attack, which was already in the making. The Americans were already saying, like, listen, this is happening. He had the US intelligence that it would happen. And he was in disbelief that this historical breach of all contracts, of all consensus, would actually go ahead. He didn't believe Vladimir Putin would do it.
But to be fair, he wasn't the only one at the time, right? Here in Germany, hardly anyone believed that until the Wednesday night before the Thursday when Vladimir Putin actually invaded.
True. And he felt the responsibility and the potential ability to turn it around. And it didn't happen. So the Munich Security Conference happened. Russia invaded Ukraine, and the Sunday after, Olaf Scholz holds this speech in Parliament. He calls Parliament together, and he single-handedly decides 100 billion extra for the German military, which is just completely off the scale here in Germany. It was somewhat agreed with his pretty fresh coalition, but they didn't even know the figure. Like most of Parliament didn't know the 100 billion figure that he was about to mention. And I can almost say, and the rest is history. This is quite a remarkable turnaround for a social democrat whose party still believes in future cooperation with Russia.
That's right. So this was part of the tradition of the Social Democrats, yeah, that they thought that Germany needs to be a kind of a bridge to Russia, that it has a historical responsibility.
And they still believe that now.
Democrats, some of them,
So the elements of this thing, the Zeitenwende, the turning point, so that was partly investment in the military, saying that, so certainly German investment in the military had absolutely sort of shrunk to virtually barely over 1% of GDP over the years. So a push of money into the military, but also connected to this, I think it was the day before that the government decided that it was going to send proper weapons to Ukraine instead of helmets and things like that, which they had agreed to beforehand. So this was a major shift for Scholz's party, but also for the country, right, Nina?
Absolutely. And I just want to add that those 3 days between Putin's attack and Olaf Scholz's speech felt very long at the time because we really didn't know what the new chancellor was going to do, because we knew about his tradition, because we knew that they're very proud of this tradition. We haven't mentioned one of their biggest figures, Willy Brandt, who they still hold up very, very high. I mean, their party headquarters is called Willy Brandt House, right? So Willy Brandt is a name outside as well, because he managed to essentially bring East and West Germany together more, because he tried to build bridges in the Cold War period. And they're very, very proud of this tradition. So at the time, on the 24th, 25th, 26th of February, really nobody knew which side would Olaf Scholz choose. Would they give up Ukraine? That was quite possible.
Yeah.
You know, would they just think, okay, Zelensky is probably going to leave the country, and then we're just going to say, yeah, but, you know, I mean, Russia has his arguments in the Kremlin, so we'll better stay out of it. And no, he didn't. So I think that is something where Olaf Scholz personally had a lot of convincing to do. He has a very strong figure in his own party in the German parliament, Rolf Mützenich, who is somebody very much rooted in this old SPD tradition of trying to somehow find a way of dealing with Russia, if not building close ties with Russia. So Rolf Mützenich had to come on board, essentially, and that was such a reinvention of their own political strategy making that many people just thought, wow, this truly is a turning point that can't be underestimated.
And of course, the timing of that speech, it was so short, soon after the invasion. This was a time when it still was considered possible or even likely that the Ukrainian government would fall, that Russia would barge through and take the whole of Ukraine. I remember the defense department here, the defense ministry briefing that they thought maybe it would take about 2 weeks or something for the Russians to win.
Actually, we know that Volodymyr Zelensky had conversations with leading members of the German government who were essentially telling him this is going to be over in a couple of days.
Yeah, so that was the context of this turning point, was the mindset, Ukraine is probably going to fall, and then we're going to have Russia not
on the Polish border,
on the Ukrainian border, but on the Polish border, And that's why Germany needs to massively get its act together in terms of defense.
It was also a moment, though, where there was a moment where Europe thought, hey, the Germans are going to lead in this. And they, the argument is politically he didn't in the end, but he did in terms of support for Ukraine. Yeah. That's the debate.
So support for Ukraine has continued, but there's a sense, and I was in the States recently, and there's a sense from many US observers that this turning point, this Zeitenwende, has fizzled out. And one American saying to me they felt the reason it has fizzled is because Ukraine was so successful. And Russia has been kept at the Ukrainian border and did not take over Ukraine. Talk to me about that. Are the Americans right to perceive that this turning point has turned out to be less impactful than Scholz claimed at the time?
Well, let's put it this way. 100 billion, I mean, when you ask Olaf Scholz about it now, 3 years later, he will argue that this was a huge turning point, 100 billion extra. And that in itself, in Germany, in the internal German debate, is a Zeitenwende. There's still an awe of this turnaround in policy in terms of beefing up the German military again. Actually, with the defense minister, Boris Pistorius, calling on the country that the German military needs to be able to defend the country again, which just sounds completely
strange. They need
strange.
to be ready for war.
Ready for war, but also, the lower bar is able to defend the country. Well, that's the whole reason that it exists. Yeah. So it's almost has comical aspects if you look from the outside into Germany. Looking at Germany from the outside, that's the thing. Barely reaching 2% now with this extra money. Germany perceived to be dragging its feet in terms of support for Ukraine when it comes to that particular weapon system.
The cruise missiles.
Longer range cruise missiles. The Taurus system, which is state of the art. It seems to be the best on the market, if you ask anyone.
And Scholz is still adamant we're not going to provide that to Ukraine.
Well, he's made it his political hallmark because the inner German sentiment is, we don't want to get dragged into this. If you look at the polling, Germans want Ukraine to win. They want the situation to be stable, but they're not energized by a struggle for the freedom of Europe and a pushback against Russia.
That weapon system, I mean, that's the argument, right? You need to have some sort of that's the argument that being put forward by the Social Democrats. You need to have German intelligence, German soldiers actively helping Ukrainians operate it. And then the weapon system has such a range that it could potentially reach the outskirts of Moscow. Yeah. And that is something, a German weapon hitting a target somewhere out of Moscow, even though the Ukrainians are saying we wouldn't do that. But,
And the criticism goes from the Ukrainian side, and we even heard that from a Holocaust survivor in the Bundestag speaking on Holocaust Remembrance Day. The criticism there is that you owe us as well. The German atrocities in Ukraine were as bad as anything that happened against Russia.
But just to answer to your initial question, the American perspective, I think it's a correct assessment from that perspective, because the Germans did what they do best. They paid up. They don't have a skin in the game. And the question now is, where is the concept from the German side for future defense in Europe? And where's the concept from the German side for Ukraine? And that's where Germany has been looking to the United States as the superpower in NATO, but it hasn't taken leadership of this whole scenario. Now, Olaf Scholz would protest, but that perspective is totally understandable from a US perspective.
Yeah.
And I think, but we have to talk about a different aspect of turning point of Zeitenwende, right? Because it's not just 100 billion euros. It's also the fact that the government at the time then, Olaf Scholz, the Greens and the neoliberal, business-friendly, whatever you want to call them, liberals that were together in the coalition at the time, they decided to also stop German dependency on Russian gas, essentially proving Donald Trump right, who had said, what are you doing? Why are you getting those cheap deals? And why am I having to invest into NATO and you're not paying up? So this is something I think that has an even bigger implication than the question, how much money do we give to Ukraine? The fact that Germany willingly said, OK, no more Russian gas. And I think they did that at the time without coming up with a proper strategy. What if this war drags on for a long time? They were hoping for the Americans to take a lead so that they could somehow overcome the transition that was needed in terms of energy supplies, finding different alternative energy sources, etc. But now we're in year 3 of this war. And Germany has been hit very, very hard. And of course, that is not something that is very popular with German voters and the German businesses.
Yeah, well, that brings us on to the sort of second crisis that Scholz government has been really marked by, and that is this economic stagnation. Now it's in fact worse than stagnation. 2 years of recession have now just been confirmed, and growth forecasts for this year are also infinitesimally
0.3% instead of 1.1. So
that's the official government projection.
Yes.
If you ask the Federation of German Industry, they say 0.1%. I mean, it's so close to zero, it could easily dip into the negative.
It's still there. The economy is there.
So the economy is not doing well. There's also been high inflation, which is also something that has affected many countries, of course, in the wake of COVID. And
that's become more steady. That's steadied out now.
That has come down, but we see in polling that the German population, their top either one or two issue is definitely the economy. So, Michaela, walk us through a little bit more so there's been a kind of an energy hit to Germany. Walk us through that a little bit, of this impact of higher energy prices. How does that affect the German economy?
Well, it affected the German economy across the board, because it's not just consumers, it's industry, it's everything. And it's an open secret that part of the success of the German economy was that it was running on cheap Russian gas, something that was criticized by European partners and the Americans for a very long time, that there was an over-reliance. So because Germany reacting to pressure when it weaned itself off this.
And that's particularly important in Germany, because Germany is still a heavily industrialized economy compared to, say, US or UK, France. It's got...
And export-oriented,
Yeah, so it needs cheap energy to produce steel, to produce chemicals, things like that.
That's the good news, that Germany is actually still producing things. Yeah, that is the envy of other big countries here in Europe, particularly in Europe, Britain and France, for instance. But then it has to be said that this was compensated very fast. That is actually a success story. That first winter after the Russian attack on Ukraine is a huge success story. It cost billions and billions of euros to compensate. They were pumping lots of cash into keeping energy prices down. LNG terminals were built, or temporary ones were just set up.
Liquefied natural gas. So that's liquefied gas
coming from the United States, something the Americans really want to supply more of in the future. So that situation was stabilized. But the economic indicators were already pointing downwards. And over the past 2 years, I've been in many background briefings where the chancellor was adamant that it would pick up again, that it was simply not happening. He was almost, in a sense, in denial of the facts and figures that were coming through, saying that the reality is different. But now time told the truth that it wasn't. Yeah. And now we have the alarm bells ringing across German industry saying there's too much bureaucracy, energy prices are too high, skilled labor is a problem. These are all problems that other countries have as well, but they were tackled earlier. And the OECD countries, these are the most important economic powers in the world. Germany is bottom of the list in terms of growth. As the third largest economy, that it still is, third or fourth, depending on which day you ask, this is an underperformance, to put it mildly. And so,
the government is getting the blame. Of course, any government that's in power while the economy is in trouble it's normal for it to get the blame. But the government is being blamed for not doing enough to improve, getting through that initial crisis, okay, maybe, but not doing enough medium to long term to sort out extra high energy costs. Plus also not doing enough to tackle bureaucracy. But also there's a lot of criticism out there about the big German industrial companies too, right? For instance, the car industry, which is really a super important industry and, of course, the best known internationally. The car industry was sort of asleep at the wheel on the transition to electric cars and is really struggling on that right now with competition from China.
And that is exactly what you always have to add as well when you talk about the energy crisis. You talk about the German economy. Germany, over the last 3 years, has seen its business model collapse. We had a business model, and we've said it before in this podcast, so sorry for anybody who feels like they've heard it before, but I don't think you can stress that enough, that the Americans provided security. Now we have to pay for ourselves. Then the Chinese bought our cars. Hey, they're better at electric cars now than we are. And then the Russians provided the cheap gas. And that is also no longer happening. We've imposed sanctions on Russia. So having to deal with all of that, you would have hoped to have a government in place that would come up with some sort of a strategic vision. How do we tackle this? How do we deal with this multitude of crises? And they have been very reactive. They have been successful, like Michaela was saying, especially in the first winter. And you see that reflected in the polls. Germans were quite happy with that government because, you know, there were no dark months where we had power outages or anything. Could have been possible, right, at the time. Yeah. There was a big fear. But Germans were happy. And then as you know, the longer the war dragged on, you could see the polls going down because, of course, there are a lot of Germans who still think one day it's going to go away.
Yeah. Well, they're clinging on to their money. It's not that Germans don't have money; they're just not spending any money.
Yeah. Well, obviously, confidence is a major issue within the economy. Okay, but I think that brings us very well to the third kind of crisis of this Scholz era, and that is the crisis of his own government to act. So you indicated that, Nina. I mean, dealing with all of these issues requires a lot of political strategic strength within any government, and that has been lacking. This government that Olaf Scholz has led is 3 parties. This was new in German federal politics. The Social Democrats from the centre-left, the Greens, of course, environmentalists, and the Free Democrats, they're called. So as you mentioned them earlier, they're kind of a pro-business party. And they all had ultimately very different ideas about how you have to deal with these different crises and how to prioritize among them. So this has led to political deadlock. We've got a soundbite, another couple of soundbites from here, which we'll play and I will translate afterwards. And this is from last November, just around the time that Donald Trump was re-elected in the United States. Olaf Scholz's coalition government fell apart. And we have a soundbite from the moment that Olaf Scholz announced that here in Berlin. Let's hear the first part of that. I'll translate and then we'll go on to the second bit.
Meine Damen und Herren, ich habe den Bundespräsidenten soeben um die Entlassung des Bundesministers der Finanzen gebeten. Ich sehe mich zu diesem Schritt gezwungen, um Schaden von unserem Land abzuwenden.
So that is Scholz saying at a press conference hastily organized, ladies and gentlemen, I have informed the federal president that I would like to fire the Ministry of Finance. The Minister of Finance. I see myself forced to take this step to prevent damage to our country. Let's hear the second part.
Wir brauchen eine handlungsfähige Regierung, die die Kraft hat, die nötigen Entscheidungen für unser Land zu treffen.
So there he's saying we need a government that is capable of action, that has the power to make the necessary decisions for our country. So there was a dramatic moment going on in the United States. Donald Trump's election, of course.
It was a crazy day.
And then
sorry,
Olaf Scholz.
And you both weren't there.
A very dramatic moment.
We're in the US.
I know you were.
We thought the story was there. Yeah.
I know.
And then a really equally dramatic moment here in Berlin, really, for German politics, with Olaf Scholz coming out and saying, I'm firing my finance minister.
Absolutely, and so the words he used.
What happened? So who was his finance minister and how did this moment arrive?
We talked about that in the very first episode of this podcast, actually, Richard, because we recorded that just a few hours after this press conference. I'd gone to that press conference on Wednesday evening, and we had initially planned an episode on German reaction to Donald Trump 2.0 on Thursday morning, and then we had to talk about the German coalition collapse. So if you want all the details, go back to our very first episode of this podcast. But in a nutshell, they didn't agree on how to finance all of the solutions to all of these multiple crises. And Christian Lindner refused to take on extra debt.
So that's the finance minister.
He was the finance minister at the time. And Olaf Scholz and the Greens were very much prepared to take out extra money, take out extra debt, and come up with ideas how to refinance that later. And said, other countries do that. Why are we the only ones who are sticking to these tight rules when everybody else is seeing, extraordinary situations require extraordinary measures, but they just simply couldn't agree on that. And what led to this point, and the finance minister wasn't expecting that, was that Olaf Scholz had had enough, because he'd heard rumours as well of the FDP essentially plotting to be fired from the government.
Yeah.
And that was something that was quite remarkable in that press conference. Olaf Scholz stood there, and Michaela, you know that. He doesn't very often read from a prompter, but he did. He had his whole speech prepared, even though he'd only just fired him. So that is something that you don't pull together very quickly.
And that speech was full of
strong words and loss of trust.
I mean, he had
very
scripted
emotional.
a speech where he said that the finance minister was too politically immature to carry responsibility. But before this all descended into soap opera drama, essentially the government hadn't been able to really act together for almost a year after their budget was blown apart by a constitutional court ruling. Now, I don't want to get too inside baseball on this, but ever since this foundation, the cash that was supposed to fund this government was strapped from them, and they were more than 12 billion euros short, depending on when you asked them. That was when this government became unstable, and whenever they reached a compromise, they started tearing it apart the next week. So Germany had already seen almost a year of constant government infighting, and Olaf Scholz had essentially, in the end, had enough. He's also a former finance minister who, at a time when Germany was already criticized for a lack of investment in infrastructure, refused to take out extra loans, despite the fact that Germany would have received more money back than they took out, because these were times of such
negative interest rates.
Yes, negative interest rates. Germany would have made money by taking out loans.
Olaf Scholz is not somebody who easily throws money at the people, right? I mean, he also has an idea of how to keep your budget in order so that it doesn't get attacked normally under normal circumstances.
He wanted to instill this
very
debt
fiscally
break
disciplined,
in Germany.
usually.
He's one of the fathers of it.
Okay, so basically the government, in a nutshell, the government collapsed because it couldn't agree on these issues of budgeting, essentially. Can the German government take out more debt to fund high priority projects? But so that was kind of the crux of the issue that blew it up. And you had one party, the Free Democrats, which was very kind of hardline, old school on debt, and the other parties, which were more centre-left inclined, that were more open to debt. But perhaps also stepping back, the bit that has been so damaging about this has been this combined sense of inability of this government to act, and infighting, public infighting.
Terrible damage.
And this has been hugely corrosive.
And
for
lack
the
of vision,
population.
Richard. But, this government did have the opportunity twice. They should have sat down. They should have renegotiated some parts of their coalition treaty. They should have done that after Russia invaded Ukraine. That was a missed opportunity. Okay, they had to act really fast, and I don't think the day had enough hours for them to throw out all these new rules, essentially, when it came to Russian energy supplies, etc. And then the second one that Michaela mentioned, the Constitutional Court rule, they definitely, and Christian Lindner also admits that, they should have sat down and said, okay, what do we do now? Which projects do we prioritize? Because they didn't reprioritize, and that then led to a bizarre situation where they knew they had less money than they'd planned, but everybody was still sticking to their pet projects.
Yeah. So this has contributed to the collapse of support for the parties in this coalition, but particularly the Social Democrats, that party of compromise, as you described it earlier, Michaela. And also it's dragged down Olaf Scholz, his own personal popularity, because voters thought, well, you're the chancellor.
Why are you not stopping this?
Your government is at war with itself. You're not in control. And I thought one very striking figure that I saw in a recent poll was people were asked, is Scholz a strong leader? Does he show strong leadership? Only 16% of people said yes. 76% said no.
Yeah, and that's also from the Social Democrats, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he, as one of his claims going into this role was, if you order leadership, you will get leadership from me.
Yeah. So we've seen a crisis of confidence in this government, and this is all partly kind of fed support for the AfD on the far right, and also potentially the BSW, the populist party on the far left. And this is kind of combined with maybe a fourth crisis, this kind of slow burn loss of acceptance within Germany of the very high migration that has happened into Germany over the last decade or so. Nina, how is this all combined into a brew that sees the SPD collapse down to 16% and the AfD overtake it to become the second most popular party?
I think the SPD are not very good at winning the narrative in the first place. They have implemented a lot of rules when it comes to the criticism of you haven't done enough to curb migration and to curb the influx of migrants who don't belong here or have no right to stay in this country. And when actually you look at their measures, they have reduced the numbers of asylum applications to this country. They, together with the Greens, they also have stepped up deportations. So they have implemented a lot of measures in the past. But I think there is a general sense, some people really feel like there needs to be a drastic change. And this is something where people feel tempted to look for easy solutions. And the Conservatives are accusing the SPD and the Greens of essentially having doubled the AfD compared to 2021, because in 2021 they were at, 10%?
Just over 10%.
And now they're looking at potentially 20, 23. Yeah. Matt said in our episode, possibly 25%.
Yeah.
That is massive.
Okay, so let's look now at the election final part here. So what is next for Scholz? We've just heard about the reasons for his unpopularity and the unpopularity of the party. So Scholz's pitch for this election, what is it? We heard at the beginning more prudence. What is it beyond that? It sounds like more of the same.
Well, it's kind of a back to the future promise, saying that things will remain steady, that nobody will be left behind, that nobody will have to make cuts, that everything will get better. This is not completely original, particularly in an election campaign, but I just want to tell one instance where he was challenged, for instance, on the pension system. It's a very bread and butter issue here in Germany, like anywhere. Yeah. And this was just this week where he got the question, look, you are promising that the contributions to the pension will remain stable. Is the pension safe? And he said, well, the contributions did remain stable. You will see we've kept them stable. The bit he doesn't mention is that a quarter of the German budget on tax money is spent to keep it stable. So, in fact, he was denying the fact that less people have to pay for more people. The baby boomers are now all going into pension. So there is a huge spending gap. So he is shying away from addressing that there might be cuts that need to be made. There might have to be a reprioritization of the German budget. And this could hurt. Yeah. And this is not the message the Social Democrat Party can sell to its own members, let alone an electorate, because they are about the constant struggle of improving conditions and of making life safer, of keeping people financially more stable.
I think what the SPD are trying to do in this election campaign is they're trying to win back workers. I mean, we talked about how they started off as a workers' party, and they're losing this group of people to the other parties. They're losing that to the Left Party, they're losing them to the AFD, and they're losing them to the group of non-voters. People really are not going to think, I'm a worker, I get up in the morning and I do my job, and then, I can buy my own house and then I'll live in peace and I'll vote SPD because thank you very much. People are beginning to compare what they've got in their pockets after having done a whole day's work compared to how much money does an immigrant get, just for doing nothing and essentially waiting for, I'm repeating what we're hearing when we go to party conventions at the AFD, etc. But especially that group of people, the SPD are trying to win back by making all these promises and addressing people like the ordinary people that Olaf Scholz speaks about.
And there are some quite basic bread and butter policies like an increase in the minimum wage to 15 euros, where he's the same level of promise that's coming from parties further to the left. But what's going on now in the run-up to the election, there's a fight about the Conservatives' approach to the AFD on this issue of migration. There's a big fight brewing there between Olaf Scholz, who's accusing the Conservatives of getting too close to the AFD. Let's not get into the details now, we need to wrap up. But is that an opportunity that could help Scholz?
I like it when Richard is so strict.
Is that an opportunity that could help Scholz in the lead up to the election?
Yes, if you want it really short, because Scholz now needs for Friedrich Merz to make a huge mistake.
Another one.
No, a really huge mistake. And that's how he got elected last time around, actually. He was polling badly. And then, Laschet, from the Conservative CDU-CSU candidate, was caught in a gaffe. It really doesn't matter, but it cost him dearly in the polls. And that's how Olaf Scholz was elected. This time around, he hopes for the same thing to happen, but this time he is the face of a failed coalition. So there's even more stacked against him. The polls are, the personal popularity ratings are hugely stacked against him. So he needs Friedrich Merz to make a mistake.
Because people are saying that the Conservatives have broken a taboo. They've said that they wouldn't tolerate any sort of collaboration with the far-right AFD, and then they put forward a motion, and it only got through the parliament because the AFD voted.
But the motion itself condemns the AFD. So I just want to qualify that. The motion itself condemns the AFD. There were no conversations. And in the past, many bills from both sides, from all sides, have been passed with votes of the AFD. What is new here is that the AFD votes were crucial to actually reach a majority on a motion that is not legally binding. So
okay, that's a conversation for another time, but it could be an opportunity for Olaf Scholz. But as you said, it might not be enough. He's obviously blamed for being leader of an unpopular government. Final question. If he fails, if Scholz's party performs badly, he has to quit. Who's next? Who are the next people to watch in Social Democrat politics, and who should our listeners be looking out for?
If the SPD gets into the next government, for example, together with the Conservatives,
as a junior partner,
exactly, because the Conservatives would not have enough votes to have a majority by themselves. If they choose the Social Democrats, if they somehow find a way of overcoming the current struggles, then definitely Boris Pistorius, the German defense minister, is going to be a member of the next cabinet. That is without question. That is somebody who is appreciated by the majority of Germans.
Very popular.
Very popular. He was even tipped to well, people essentially urged him to put himself forward as the SPD's social democratic chancellor candidate.
To replace Scholz.
To replace Scholz and actually provoke him to step down. But Boris Pistorius then said, no, I never wanted to do that. And he's very loyal to Olaf Scholz. So that could be a bit difficult to overcome how much he can manage to distance himself from Olaf Scholz. But definitely Boris Pistorius. Then we've got Lars Klingbeil, who is in his mid-40s and currently one of the two party leaders. Definitely a person to watch, Lars Klingbeil, who is also sort of a realist and is trying to keep this party together in one of their biggest identity crises.
Yeah. Final thought, Michaela. I mean, if the Social Democrats do get into the next government as a junior partner, then it won't be they've been in power for 23 out of 27 years. They'll be in power for 27 out of 31 years. Are there voices in the party, there are voices in German politics saying, hey, maybe it's good for a party to have a period out of government to kind of refresh its platform, come up with fresh ideas?
Well, there's actually a very concrete example. The conservative CDU-CSU post-Merkel in opposition over these past 3+ years has used this time to re-energize its own followers, its own members. It's become more conservative again. And the question what being a social democrat means in the future hasn't been able to get addressed in opposition. So yes, it could be a very constructive time for the Social Democrats to regroup and essentially relaunch their bid to remain a Big Ten party, because that's the struggle they are in right now. At the same time, our election system is built to force politicians to make compromises. And that's why we have coalition governments pretty much all the time. So it will be very difficult for the Social Democrats not to say yes if they have even just half or 1 percentage point more than the Greens. And that's the neck and neck race we're seeing right now. Who the natural partner for a coalition will be for the conservative CDU-CSU, who are still leading in the polls, although we're all waiting with bated breath how much this whole co-voting with the far-right Alternative for Germany might cost them or might give them in the polling.
Okay. All right. Thanks very much to both of you. And that wraps up this edition of Berlin Briefing. A lot to think about there. And yeah, we'll see if maybe Olaf Scholz's final gift to his party is a defeat in this election, which enables it to kind of come up with a fresh vision of what it stands for. But that wraps up this Berlin Briefing for now. Thanks for listening on any podcast provider, or thanks for watching on YouTube if you've been watching there. And do leave a comment there on YouTube if you like. And also we'll leave some links on related stories if you want to dig deeper into Olaf Scholz and the SPD. And also do check out our newsletter, also called Berlin Briefing. You can find that on dw.com. That's a great run through every week of news from Germany. But for now, that's it from us.